Historical Commission, and I wanted to share with you a partnership between the Metro Historical Commission and the Metro Nashville Police Department. And so we'll be talking about the work we did at Sunnyside this past spring, early spring. So the Metro Historical Commission, for those who don't know, is a historic preservation agency created in 1966. It serves to document the history and archaeology of Nashville and greater Davidson County, We also save, reuse buildings, make the public more aware of the necessity of preservation, and more recently attend to archaeology. Our office is growing. We currently have 16 staff members and hope to have 18 next year. We're also made up of the Metro Historic Zoning Commission, which reviews applications for new historic overlays and reviews and approves preservation permits in historic and conservation districts for new construction, alterations, additions, repairs, and demolition. So we basically attend to the historic and archaeological resources of Davidson County. Now we're going to be talking today about Sunnyside, which is actually the home of the Metro Historical Commission. For those who don't know the history of Sunnyside, was built in 1852 for Mary Childers Benton, who was the wife of Jesse Benton, who famously was involved in a pistol duel with Andrew Jackson and subsequently left the state. Mary Benton stayed in the house. She incorporated 2 cedar log structures that were on the property into the main house that was built, and these are the 2 structures we'll be talking about today. Miss Benton is believed to have owned 20 individuals during this time period. At or during the Civil War, she moved out of the property, and John Schutt and his daughter, Janet Childress, lived on the property. In 1875, the property was sold to Joseph Spence and then turned over shortly after in 1882 to Dr. Knoll, who was a dentist and also taught dentistry at Vanderbilt. Property sold again in 1920 to Granville Sevier, and then in 1945 it was purchased by Parks. And Parks used it for recreation. They actually put in a recreation center, a pool, a swimming pool, and tennis courts. And then in 2004, it was renovated and has since become the home of the Metro Historical Commission and is currently being renovated right now. And that's why we're here. Some of the things we found during the renovation. All right, to give you some more context to the work the police departments could be talking about, just a very general overview of the Battle of Nashville occurring between December 15th and 16th, 1864, between the armies of Lieutenant General Hood as well as General George Thomas of the Union. And it begins really with Hood coming up from Franklin after the Battle of Franklin from the south. He comes to the outskirts of Nashville by December 2nd. But he's facing a very formidable situation, about 7 miles of entrenchments. So the Union has occupied Nashville since February of 1862. And they've established fairly massive fortifications, and it's great that we're able to do this talk right here at the largest fortification, Fort Negley. All right, so Hood has a choice. He's outnumbered. He decides to pursue a defensive strategy, to build defensive works, and to goad Thomas into attacking him. Confederates established essentially 4 miles of entrenchments to the south of the main Union lines. Just kind of orient you here, the picture on the left, you can see the circle of marked in green with the blue lines. You can see the Union fortifications, but that green circle is showing you Fort Negley. All right, and to the south, you can see that purple circle, and that is actually the Sunnyside Mansion. Okay, so you can see they're actually not that far apart. All right, and then over to on your right-hand side, you can see essentially a battle map on December 15th. And so that purple circle indicates the Sunnyside Mansion. You can see that dotted line going through it. And we believe that's the essentially the forward position of the Confederates, their picket line. So it actually crosses through their property. So essentially, Sunnyside is almost in no man's land between the two opposing sides. All right, so I've set the context here. I'm going to turn it over to the police department to detail their research on the property.
Hello, my name is George Boughton. I work for the Metro Police Department. Also here with me today, Officer Stephen Jones, Officer Doug Belcher. They are assigned to the crime scene investigation section of the police department. I am a civilian employee now. I retired after almost 31 years and with the police department, and I was very blessed to come back to work for them soon after retirement. I spend my day partially with the crime scene investigation section, and I also work upstairs in the firearms unit. This is our involvement in this. Outline of what you're going to hear is what the crime scene investigation section does about shooting reconstruction, 3D scanner basics, drones and photogrammetry, the Sunnyside investigation, and the results of the investigation. An overview of the crime scene investigation section. We work 24/7, 365. There's crime scene investigators working every day of the year. There are both sworn and civilian employees, sworn being police officers, and civilians who are not police officers. We all do pretty much the same job. We have, there are calls that we go to, and over the course of a shift, one of the things that you may end up getting a request for or determining what you need is to do some type of documentation of a shooting incident. We document, we process, we collect. Part of what we do is we take crime scene photos, we do diagrams, and we collect evidence. And in the field, we can do some scientific processes. I am a certified crime scene investigator still. So is Officer Jones and Officer Belcher. That's through the International Identification Association. And the new investigators, when they come in this section, they also go to the National Forensic Academy, which is out of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. It's in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Our facilities are out at the Madison precinct, I guess in the north part of the county. We're on the ground level, and upstairs is the crime lab, and the precinct occupies the other part of the building. What we do when we do shooting reconstruction is the goal is we want to determine origination. We're trying to figure out where the bullet came from. And to a lesser extent, we're trying to do sequencing. There are things that we can do with like a windshield or something like that we can tell which bullet passed through it first and which one passed through it last. Bullets are predictably unpredictable. And once it leaves the end of the barrel, it can be hard to determine what happens to it in its flight path. And you'll hear this interchange. You'll hear these two phrases interchange. You'll hear trajectory and you'll hear flight path. They're interchanged, used kind of the same way. We deal with internal, external, and terminal ballistics. Internal, when you look at it, and I'm going to move around. Internal ballistics is everything that happens to a bullet inside of the weapon. This is really simple. External ballistics is when the bullet leaves the end of the barrel. One of the first things that happens as soon as the bullet leaves the end of the barrel, gravity takes hold of it. Gravity comes into play and starts pulling it down. Terminal ballistics is what, when a bullet reaches where it's going, we call it terminus. And terminal ballistics is what happens when it reaches its terminus. Again, flight path, it concerns the path of the projectile in flight. We use, this was my shooting kit when I was a crime scene investigator. This is one of our shooting kits. This is called a flight path rod that You'll see I've already got it in one of our demos right here. And I'll leave this up here so you can come up and look at it when we're done. We need to, this, when you have like when somebody does your drywall and there's a screw that didn't get covered up perfectly, you can call that a defect. And we use the same term in shooting reconstruction in that it's something that's not supposed to be there. Bullet hits a wall, car body, we use the term defect. And we will use these kits. We'll take 2 measurements. And again, I'm moving around. This is the protractor that we'll use. And this is a flight path rod that's been placed in a defect. We use this for training. And we'll take a measurement from that angle. And we'll also, this is an up and down. We'll take an up and down measurement on how the bullet went in. There's a third way that we can, and we'll get, I think we get through in a second. If we don't have 2 defects, what we can use is, it's called a leading edge. Is that coming up? Yes, okay. This particular case right here, this was a shooting incident, and what you've got here, this is the laser that came out of the kit. I'm also using it as a pointer. I have 2 defects in the wall right here, and what I did was one of these flight path rods, and I put the laser on the end of it. You can add what's called, it's basically smoke in a can. It's a scattering medium. It will make that laser show up. And the circumstances of this incident was there were 2 people involved. There were 2 people fighting. And one of them said that they were on the ground whenever they fired 2 shots. And one of the shots was in the other person. And the second shot was when I did right here, basically this, and I put the laser on it. You see, this shot was fired at some point across that line. So it comes all the way back down here in the hallway. And we can reasonably say that it was along that line that one of the 2 gunshots was fired. And here's an example of exactly that, to where this is the same thing. You have zone 1, which is most probable. Zone 2, yeah, it could have happened if you're going to shoot like that. And zone 3, no, there's no way. That just, no. So same thing. We know that was fired, that one shot was fired somewhere along that line. Here we're getting into defects, and this is the leading edge. That is the first point of contact whenever a bullet hits a surface. It will create something that looks like this. This right here, that's called the pinch point, and that is an area of paint that survives, that shows us where the bullet came from. And this is an embedded bullet, embedded projectile. And this is one actually that I found while we were out on the Sunnyside thing. And just for me personally, this is something that when you think about it, the last time a human touched this was in 1864. It's been that long, and it's still right there where it ended up. And I'm going to pass this off to Officer Belcher. Thank you.
And as George said, I'm Officer Belcher. I'm one of the lead people that teach our Faro scanner. So what he just spoke with you about was generally how we do a shooting reconstruction at any scene that we deal with nowadays. The old school method of doing this was literally what he showed. We would use fog in a can, lasers. I'm sure in some movies you've probably seen this happen. We are now getting a little bit more geekier now with technology. This device that you're seeing right here, now is a Faro laser measure distancing device. So what it'll do is it'll spin around 360 degrees on any scene that we go to and plot millions of points from that one scan. We will set this up multiple times. We can do it anywhere from once to more recently, we've done it over 200 times on a scene. So once we do that, it gathers all the points. So if you pretend this wall back here is just filled with a bunch of dots on this wall, just take a marker and start putting dots all over this wall, and then remove the wall and keep the dots right where they are. That's how this works. So then we can actually take that scene and be able to move around it in a 3D environment. So with those rods that he was speaking of placed in there, we can then take it within the program and be able to stretch those trajectories out in as far as we want to infinity if we want it to. Whereas before we could only go as far as a laser would go, or connecting those rods together to make a very long rod. So if we had to go through a wall for whatever reason, or through a car that wasn't there that is now there, the program allows us to now do that. We can stretch it out as far as we want to. How we used it in here, we took 7 scans around Sunnyside on the front wall of the object in question, which was one wall of what they were deconstructing. Out of those 7 scans, there was over 88.5 million points that was all combined within that. With all those points in those 7 scans, there was only a 0.103 margin of error in there. So that's not even close to a quarter of a margin of error. So highly, highly accurate. If we needed to measure one of those defects in there, we can actually click on it within the program and be able to measure how long that defect is, where it is exactly on that structure. It's documented forever now. We create diagrams and fly-throughs of these. A fly-through you'll see in just a little bit, but a diagram, this is actually a diagram of a crime scene that we worked. So after we go into the structure and scan everything within it, we can get a very highly detailed map of exactly what that structure looked like and furniture and everything that was in it. The scale that you see at the bottom, it is to scale. We can measure everything in there. The evidence markers that you see in here were casings and bullets that were found within that scene. We can place those back directly where they were within it. So this device is used pretty much for every homicide that we deal with in Nashville. Some robberies, we can use it for pretty much anything that we need to make sure that we have a highly detailed, accurate representation of it. Turn it over to Stephen Jones.
Like George and Doug both said, my name is Stephen Jones. I've been with the police department since 2009. I've been with our crime scene investigation section since 2015. And since 2017, we have been using drones to take aerial photographs. So we're talking about the old ways of using a laser for flight path and now using the Faro for flight path. The old way that we took aerial photographs was to call the police helicopter, ask them if we can get up inside of it. We would fly, hang out the side of it with a digital camera and take photos. There were a lot of limitations associated with that, as you all might imagine. We also typically can't get below about 400 or 500 feet. So we had a view that was a very broad view of scenes. And you can go back to when we were taking photographs with film, and that was how aerial photography was done, all the way up through digital cameras. This is a far superior option to taking photographs from the air. We can get as low as single-digit feet, 10, 20 feet off the ground to take photographs if we need to, or we can go up to 400 feet, generally speaking. This is regulated by the FAA, so we do have limitations on how high we can go. But our biggest limitation on how low we can get is blowing evidence around. So we literally have to be careful because of the wash coming off of the drone's propellers to not blow evidence markers around or blow evidence that's lightweight that's around on the ground. And not only can we take photographs with the drone in the same way that we would have taken photographs with a digital camera, but we can also program these to run autonomous mapping missions. And those maps can do some really, really powerful things. It's kind of difficult to see up here, but this is the mapping mission that's in the area right up here. Each one of those red dots is a position where the drone took a photograph as it ran. So if you were to actually watch this, it looks like a process similar to mowing the lawn, where we're going up and down and coming back. We can set all kinds of different parameters. We can have the camera pointed straight down. We can have the camera pointed at an angle. We generally want to have the camera pointed at an angle to get detail on facade. If you think about looking at a building from the top, you can just see the roof. You can't see the sides of it. So we would want to have that camera at an angle. And that's what we did here with Sunnyside. So we can program in that route that it ran, and you can see that it was a whole lot of photos. This is basically all of Sevier Park, or a good portion of it if you're familiar with it. Sunnyside is here in the middle, the tennis courts are down there, and the community center is over here. So we programmed that in. The photogrammetry that you see up there at the top is just a very fancy word for taking measurements from photos. This is not a new piece of technology by any means. It's just being done in a different way. Photogrammetry was done as early as the late 19th century, and it's simply taking measurements from having multiple photographs and the measurements from those. The beauty of this is where the Faro that he was talking about earlier, the 3D scanner that spins on that tripod, it is very good at being extremely accurate in smaller areas. This still has very good accuracy, not quite as high of accuracy as the Faro, but it can do very large areas. So think like city blocks, parks like this, if we need to document them. If we were to take that Faro scanner and go around, how many paces for each scan?
It's about 10 steps.
10 steps. So you can think how that might take just a little bit of time. And that was something that we did during the Christmas Day bombing in 2020 to assist the FBI as they were processing that scene. We took a scan with the Faro, took 10 steps, took another scan with the Faro, and did this for multiple city blocks downtown, basically from the river to 3rd and from Union down to Broadway. So just like what they were doing with Faro, they were also running drones over the city and taking those photographs in that grid pattern to fill in those gaps that Faro and 3D scanners give us. At a lower level, it can fill in those gaps on higher surfaces or in larger areas. So it's really, really good for large areas like this. The other main difference between how drones function and how 3D scanners function, the 3D scanner that he used, it takes a 360-degree photograph, just like the panorama function that you have on your phone camera. The other thing that it also does, like he says, is it has a laser measuring device in it that shoots that laser out, bounces off the surface, bounces back, and gives the scanner an idea of where that surface is in three-dimensional space. This has no 3D scanner like that, where it's using a laser. This is using photogrammetry, where you're taking multiple photographs. Those photographs overlap each other, usually about 75% in front of and 75% on the side of. And this is able to be input into software. We use a software called Pix4D. There's a number of different software available that do this. And they are able to produce a point cloud like he talked about with that laser scanner. They're also able to produce an orthomosaic. An orthomosaic is what you're seeing down here in the bottom right-hand corner. And that is simply where it takes all the photos that we took, arranges them, and makes them fit together and make sense on the surface of the Earth. So think about it like a Google satellite view, except it's exactly what we saw, which is why that would be very important in a crime scene. We used to go and get Google satellite views, trace over top of those, and do our diagrams. This is exactly what we're seeing, rather than what it was whenever that image was taken. And you can see some of these overlapping images down here in the bottom right-hand corner, where the two little cabins here in the center, and then they're slowly moving out of frame, and then the house is starting to move into frame. And so you can see how all of these photographs overlap each other as the drone flies through the sky and takes those photographs. So in this case, we took 1,535 photos. It took probably about an hour. Does that seem right? To take the 1,535 photos. When I ran this through Pix4D, which is our photogrammetry program, what I received was 73.9 million points. So it's still creating those points, just doing it in a different way. And our measure of accuracy when it comes to doing photogrammetry with the aircraft is called ground sampling distance. And the way you can think about ground sampling distance is that each pixel or each point in there, that is about how big it is in real life. So each one of those pixels was about 0.43 inches. What that means is that generally our level of accuracy is 2 to 3 times ground sampling distance. So for this whole area of Sevier Park, it's accurate to roughly a little less than an inch to an inch and a half in that range. And so this is a really helpful tool. We can create those orthomosaics. We can create a point cloud, and it takes the color information from the photographs, and each one of those points gets a color. And that is how you produce what really looks like a pretty photorealistic image, except this is not an image. This is a three-dimensional model that you can interact with, you can zoom in on. If we had virtual reality goggles, we could make you as big as a giant to walk around and look at, or we could make you really small, the size of a person, and you could walk around and interact in that area. And what you're going to see that we produced from this is a combination of both the point cloud that the Faro 3D measuring device creates and the point cloud that our drones are able to create using that Pix4D photogrammetry program. Does that make sense? So the investigation itself, we treated this very similarly in the way that we would any other crime scene investigation that we do. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to go out there and start documenting the scene as we find it. So we're taking photographs. We always label the defects. Labeling those defects does a couple of different things. One, it allows us to differentiate one from the other, especially when they look very similar. We just usually use numbers, so 1 through however many we have. And also, it puts a scale up there so we can look at a photograph and know exactly how large something is because we have a scale up there with inches or centimeters, whichever might be on the tape. So we started out by labeling and photographing those defects. I started running those mapping missions where I'm programming it to fly autonomously along that track, again, kind of like mowing the lawn. So it's flying over the mansion right there. And then Doug started taking measurements of those defects. So he's using that defect rod that you see right there, and he is using that device right there. That's a digital version of what George had showed you earlier. It's just a digital version of this rather than having to try and read an analog. We're getting those two different measurements, which is that angle in relation to the horizontal plane and an angle in relation to the vertical plane. And then Doug started working on completing those Faro scans that he talked about as well. So just so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about, this is a photograph that I found online of the north side of Sunnyside, facing north, circa about 1974. And the area that was still remaining when we got there that they were starting to tear down is the area inside of that red box. What I want to draw your attention to is that little peak of a roof right there. That is, I think, Adam, a root cellar it looked like of some sort. An entrance to the basement. So that gives you context of what you're seeing here versus what you're about to see, which is what we found when we got out there that looks significantly different. So this is what we found when we got out there because they were in the process of disassembling this, and there's our little roof peak right there. That's the entrance to the basement. All of the white areas that you see there are pieces of scale tape. And those are all the defects that we found out there. So something that seems, I would say, pretty significant and not just somebody who had an errant round or was doing target practice against their cabins. Those are all the defects that we located. So and we'll talk about the numbers later on, but of the defects that we were able to measure and the ones that we were not able to measure. This is a pretty fair representation of what we found among those defects. I'm not going to show you pictures of all 44 of them. The harvested projectile, there were quite a few of these that looked like someone had taken a chisel or an axe or something else to hack into the wood and extract that projectile. So they were not super careful getting that out of there. And that's all we were left with. Clearly nothing that we can do a whole lot with. We're finding that angle and then trying to stretch that out in space. However, we also had defects like this one here that actually were pretty darn good. That's the first one that we had labeled there. So this is a relatively good representative sample of what we found. So on this one, you can see now that we've added these yellow lines, you can see that leading edge that we were talking about there of where that's coming in. And that's basically where Doug was laying that rod and then taking a measurement using the protractor and using the angle finder. Among those 44 defects that we located, we found 2 projectiles. One of those projectiles was embedded. That was the one that George had shown you all earlier that was almost kind of turned there. You're looking at the base of the projectile right there. And this is another one that had penetrated the wood. So we're talking about terminology that's used in shooting incident reconstruction. A projectile that has penetrated has gone into that target surface but has not exited that target surface. And one that had perforated would have been one that passed all the way through it and continued on into a room. So this is one that had penetrated it. Interestingly enough, all of the defects that we located were penetrating defects. They were not perforating defects. And if you could see this wood from the side, it is basically like railroad ties that they used to build this house. So it was extremely good cover. These were around 48 or 50 caliber rounds, generally speaking, at that time. They had quite a bit of powder moving behind them as well that was packed in there. So this was very good cover that they were using, and likely there was a cover on top of these railroad ties, basically, to think about the wood that was used to build this house. And that's long since gone. They've obviously long since torn off what had been placed there afterwards as well. So the results of the investigation, like I said, we had 44 defects that we had identified. These projectiles that you're seeing down here at the bottom are ones that Adam found when he was checking around basically the base of the face of the cabins that you saw where we had all that was peppered with all the defects. Two of those embedded, or one embedded and one that had penetrated, were located. We were able to measure 24 of those defects with flight path rods. You can see he's using the protractor here with that flight path rod to take those measurements. Once Doug took those measurements, he then was able to mark those defects, again, with that very highly accurate Faro scan in a three-dimensional space on a computer. He was able to mark those defects, input the information that he had manually measured with those flight path rods using the protractor and using the angle finder, and then put that information into our 3D environment and then draw out, in the same way that George was showing you all earlier with that laser going out, draw a rod out showing roughly where that might have come from. And then we were able to take the Faro scans, which were kind of that limited area, and then the drone point clouds that were created of that larger area of cedar bark, and all of that was combined together. And that's what you all are going to see here in this 3D fly-through. I know the trees look blue right there. So this takes a 360-degree image, basically, so it also captures sky. And the scanner oftentimes has difficulty determining where that blue color is coming from, if it's trees or if it's sky, so it'll color the trees that way. But as we get in here tighter to this north wall, which is right here, you're going to see all these flight path rods that are coming out of this. And we'll talk about, once this video is finished, of the fly-through, we'll talk about what we had seen here that was of interest. I apologize for it being a little jerky. Unfortunately, the way that the video comes out of the program is kind of difficult to mess with. It's one of the quirks of the software that they're still working through. One of the things that we'll notice right away, we'll talk about this in a second, is there does really seem to be a very heavy concentration of fire in this area right here. We'll talk about why that might be. And we're also going to talk about why there is a flight path rod that is like 30 feet or 40 feet up in the air right here as well. And there could be a good reason for that, or maybe a not so good reason. We're going to come up here and get a little bit tighter in on that wall.
That tree was likely not there in 1864.
So the tree was likely not there in 1864. What that area is consistent with, from talking with Adam heading back out this way, was the driveway to the home. If you all go out there, there is the driveway that you actually drive up, and then next to that, that really falls on that northwest corner or gates, which was the original driveway. So what relevance that has to do with that, it's not clear. If the tree had been there, that would have made a lot of sense as using that as cover potentially, because that probably also would have stopped bullets in the same way that the structure itself, being constructed of those thick pieces of wood, stopped bullets. So why do we have something? This is a dump truck or earth mover that was out there while they're doing all these renovations. Why do we have a flight path rod that is going like 30 or 40 feet in the air? One of the reasons is we were measuring defects from 100 plus years ago that were through multiple pieces of wood that are no longer there, with not as much information as we would prefer, which would be having two corresponding defects. Could be one reason. Another thing that this illustrates, though, if we go back earlier in the presentation, George was talking about those zones of possibility. So what this would point to, if this is accurate, and it is not inaccurate because of the limitations that are associated with the measurements we were taking, is that this was just fired much, much closer. And as we draw this out into space at a pretty sharp angle, at least vertically speaking, and as we draw this out into space, it's just getting really high up. So that kind of is a good way of illustrating those zones of possibility or limiting angles when we're talking about flight path.
All right, so what does all this mean? So if we look at this data and we try and understand what this data might mean for the Battle of Nashville, kind of get some larger sequences. But what really is important about this data is it's telling us something we don't know about. So we don't know what happened at Sunnyside. We know the battle took place and Sunnyside got shot up. That was known historically, but we don't know the order of battle, where people were firing from, who was firing. And so when we use this data, we're actually able to pick apart some of the battle. And when we combine it with other archaeological data, we can kind of get a sense of how, at least on December 15th, how the battle played out at Sunnyside. And so if you look at the image to the left, the map, you can kind of look at the nature of the battle. So on December 15th, there's an action on the Confederate right. There's a retreat, and then there's a massive Union attack. So Thomas actually attacks Hood and drives Hood back. Hood on December 16th concentrates his forces, and Thomas attacks again and drives Hood back further. There's massive casualties, and the Army of Tennessee essentially ceases to exist. All right. But when we look at Sunnyside, we can kind of look at the actions on December 15th. And if you look on this image on the right with the purple circle again, you can kind of see how the Union supposedly swept in from the west. But when we look at the data that we have archaeologically as well as from the scans, where they're firing from positions from the west, but also coming in from the north. So we see a much more complicated picture of the battle and how it actually played out, where we have troops moving down the Granny White Pike and engaging the Confederates, and probably the Confederates holding up in those log structures. If you looked at the sheer number of shots, being very concentrated, probably near the windows, probably have the Confederates pickets trying to hold the Union back as the Union sweeps through from the west. All right, and when we can kind of see that when we look at some of the archaeological evidence, some of the rifle pits we found, the entrenchments, that the Confederates had a fairly strong position, but they're getting swept in from the west, and they're trying to hold their ground, and they're probably using the building at Sunnyside as kind of as a bastion before they have to retreat to the main line further to the south. And so when we looked at some of the bullets we recovered, we found a Williams cleaner as well as a 3-wing mini ball recovered from the building. Believe that these are Union rounds, so it matches kind of the order of battle as well. So we have Union rounds striking the building at these Confederate positions. So one of the reasons we also did this was because this building was being renovated. So you saw what it looked like. The siding was taken down. We found out that there were actually 2 log structures, the picture on the left. But the log structure on the left, the furthest one, had to actually be taken down because it was in such a state of disrepair. And so in order to save that information, it was essential to map it out. And luckily to have resources like we do at the police department to have this detailed information, preserve that detailed information, was crucial to be able to tell this part of the Battle of Nashville. All right, so we actually had the construction workers take the building down as soon as they were done with their scans. It was that much of a time pressure, but we have that data now preserved forever, which is fairly amazing. And I took this picture today. You can see the other cabin and how it's been incorporated back into the building. And they've decided to put viewing windows in on all of those, on several of those bullet holes, so that if you come to Sunnyside, probably in the spring, you'll be able to see some of those rounds, right, and their impact holes. So I wanted to personally thank the police department for coming out and testing their software and recording this information so it wasn't actually lost. All right, we could have photographed the bullet holes, but to have this unique data is really special. And to be able to use that, interpret that, and save this data is really, really special. So I want to say thank you to the police department. And I also want to say thank you for everybody coming out. And let's give them a round of applause. So thank you for all coming out. We have time for if you have any questions for myself or any of the officers.
How old is it? Faro technology?
The Faro technology that we have, we got that probably around 2015.
I'm just wondering why I did not make it front.
We have, even though we started doing that, then we had a piece of technology before that. It was called a Panoscan. So much like your cell phone, when you was just describing about spinning around doing a pano with that, that's pretty much what it did. But it was older technology. It took a lot longer of a time to do that. When we first got the Faro system, that's what we were using it for, is that Panoscan type thing. And it wasn't until recently that we've actually started getting the DAs involved in using this technology, and actually with the prosecutions that we've had. It's hugely beneficial when it comes to court, because we can incorporate photos into it and actually walk people through a crime scene now, as opposed to you just seeing a photo like this and then me trying to describe what's here and what's to the left of the photo that you can't see anymore, and to the right of it. We can actually put you where this photo was taken and spin you around 360 degrees and look at everything. So we're getting there with getting everybody involved in trying to learn this technology, besides just us trying to learn it and push it out. So.
Your fly-through the rods for different colors, is there a reason for that?
For this instance, the only reason that we did that is there were so many of them. Generally speaking, if we had an actual crime scene that we were going to do this kind of thing with, we would generally know sometimes how many suspects that we would have, and those would all be the same color, because there were so many of them, and it could be, every one of those could have been fired by a different person. We try to distinguish all those. That's why there's multiple different colors for everything.
Other parts of the north facade been broken down like this? I was just wondering if there's any bullets left on the right-hand side of the picture.
So,
They hit that area of the building.
so this structure here was added later on when it basically went from agricultural property to an urban property, and this was added on. These brick wings were added on. So we don't know about that phase. We do know that historically, and you can still see there's some bullet holes on the front side in the pillars. And we actually, if we flip back here. Slow. There you go. There's actually a 3-inch round up on that corner as well, projectile. So we've reported a couple rounds and when we've done archaeological testing, as well as some pieces of shot as well.
So if you backward check the lines, you get an idea where the firing positions were.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point of it. So with something like this, with it being so old and those defects going through probably multiple other surfaces before there was a facade that was on the outside of this before this siding. So it has to strike that siding, then go through that, and then end where it did. It could also have gone through anything else between that. So it slows down enough to be embedded in there. With it being so old, this obviously would settle over time as well. Those measurements are very approximate to where they come back to, but that is the main goal that we want to do with it, is pull those out enough. If it was one shooter that did this, a lot of times we do this exact type of thing for newer scenes, and they fire multiple rounds, you'll find them all come back into a triangle, into one area. And that's the good thing that we really want to see. Obviously, if someone's moving left or right or wherever, you'll see that trail move, but what you're describing is exactly what we are trying to hopefully do. But with something like this, with more than likely a lot of people firing at it, they could have been everywhere around here. So.
Can you explain how somebody decided to get the police department involved in a crime scene? And then that's been pulling boards off the outside and said, oh, wait a minute, who do we call?
So when I was hired, this building had just been pulled apart, and I went outside and took a look at it and started noticing the holes. And then I found a round in the hole. And then I thought, well, how am I going to record this as an archaeologist? We know part of this building is going to be taken down. How do we preserve this? And then I thought, well, we could get more information from this. How can we record that information? And I asked my colleagues, and they suggested, why don't you contact the police department And so I reached out, and thankfully you guys were willing to test your software. And it kind of went from there. And so I think we're very fortunate to be able to have this level of expertise. And you could just see the technology. When they were out, it was, what, an hour and a half, and you had everything recorded, but to process it and to be able to say what it means that's a whole level of expertise I don't have. But one of the great things is now we could take this and we could do a metal detector survey of Sevier Park. And we can look for firing lines, we can look at positions. The Vanderbilt Institute for Spatial Research has done a whole bunch of ground penetrating radar surveys. So we can look at for other entrenchments and positions. We can combine all of that data to really flesh out this story. So this is one piece of this amazing research.
Other than maybe competitive being in the building, you said probably the federals were coming down Grand White Pike. Any idea which unit that was?
If I knew the battle, I probably could tell you that.
I'll ask Tracy.
Tracy would know. But we don't have a lot. Actually, we have one. So far, we've done one journal entry talking about a structure west of Montgomery Hill. So we don't have a lot. What's happening specific on the property from historical records? We just don't have that data.
Could you talk a little bit about the archaeology and some of the things that you found on the property?
Sure. So one of the things we've been doing is a lot of archaeological testing for areas that are going to be impacted, where they're going to put in a new road, or where they're going to need to put trenches in for utility lines. And so it's actually been very beneficial because we've had students from Vanderbilt as well as MTSU come out, anthropology and archaeology students come out and do testing. And we found a whole slew of different features, artifacts, really from the beginning of the history of the property in the 19th century through the 20th century, showing various uses of the property. Last week, we actually excavated the cistern on the property, which turned out to be over 9 feet deep. We weren't able to go any further. But pieces of the Civil War, bullets, shells, and also a really nice slice of life in late 19th century Nashville and 20th century Nashville. So ceramics, bones, bottles, lots of fragments of all kinds of different items. So it's helping to flesh out further the history of Sunnyside and people who lived at Sunnyside. One of our main goals has been to locate some of the outbuildings that might have held enslaved people at Sunnyside. We haven't been able to find those yet. But currently, we're trying to just test where things are going to be impacted and destroyed first. Does that answer your question?
So with the degradation of the structure, did the technology that the police used, did that factor in any of the margin of error? Because, I mean, with the building that it sagged in a little bit, boards might have been out of place. Did that take into account with where the trajectory was putting in at?
Absolutely. So normally how all those lines would have looked if we were compiling this for a court case now, there would be a cone that surrounds it. That would factor in that error rate in it. If we were going to do that for this, that cone would be a lot larger, because what we really like to try to do, instead of the one defect and line that into that leading edge like we talked about, we like to find two. So if it went through this wall and then the other wall, we can take that rod and it's anchored into 2 points now. You can't move it around. With something like this, we do this on scenes now, but it's less accurate in that we're just laying it on that edge as it strikes that one surface, and then we're trying to get measurements off of that. That's a lot less accurate just doing it that way, period. But with this as being as old as it is, if we were going to give an error rate on this, it would be a lot higher than the normal 5 degrees that we do for one nowadays. So strictly the lines that you saw was just the line that we took that rod out of it. If you would see the cones, it would fill up the whole presentation. You wouldn't be able to see anything. So that's why we removed those.
So that one shot that was from the moon down into the building, is it feasible that was, that had been kind of lobbed into the building?
Absolutely. It could be. I don't know. We didn't. The really good thing, getting back to your previous question a little bit more on that, the technology, and this is just us, when the call came to us to help out with this, we didn't know where it came from, but we jumped on it. This was really interesting for us to do. We obviously never got to do anything like this before. This not necessarily is a crime scene, but it was preserving a lot of history, and we are somewhat of history buffs, and we really jumped on doing this. It gave us a chance with the Faro stuff, things being somewhat new from 2015 prior. The drone photogrammetry with this is brand new. This is only the second time that we combine drone data with Faro data to give a larger perspective on an area and be able to use our shooting trajectory rods in this fashion, be able to pull them out to as far as we need to. So this gave us a great opportunity to test out the technology that we have, and we believe did very well on it. But as for the rod that is going out into space, that is absolutely something that could happen. If that cone was in there, that cone would spread out further. That means that anywhere within that large circle, with that rod being the direct center of it, that's where someone could have been holding a rifle at that time. We didn't put that in there, but with that cone, it gives it a lot more possibility with that error rate that it could be more possible that on a hill further away, that's where it came from. So just with the rods that you saw sticking out, that's not a concrete, that's exactly where it came from. So you have to give that error rate as well with that.
Possible the board just tilted up with the bullet in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, anything could have happened, and as long as it is, that board could have started settling and falling backwards.
Tilt the line down and get more consistent.
Absolutely.
Any graves found on the property that you know?
Not that I know of, no. No. So this was a much larger parcel, and over time, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, it became truncated. So I think there's 23 acres in the park now, and it used to be, I think, up to 78 or so acres for the larger farm. So, but I don't know of any graves.
What's the new building going to be used for?
It's still the Metro Historical Commission, but it's going to be much more spacious. And so we'll actually have, there's upwards of 4 people in the office now, so people actually have more room inside. Mm-hmm. It looks beautiful now. Well, thank you all for coming out. If you have any further questions, you can talk to us, but thank you so much.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.